In today's video podcast, I want to clear up a misunderstanding about what happens when a buyer sends a termination notice under an option when the option does not exist. It is a common misconception that when a buyer sends the notice of termination claiming a right under the option that does not exist for whatever reason, that the buyer is then in default. The seller immediately makes demand for the earnest money. The reality is, if the buyer does not have an option, a notice of termination under the option is simply not effective. The act of providing notice when no right exists is not a default under the contract. The ineffective notice simply means the contract is still in place. Therefore, both buyer and seller are still bound under the terms of the contract and must proceed accordingly. Unless and until buyer then fails to perform his obligations under the contract, will buyer be in default and the seller can pursue his remedies. In turn, though, in order to hold a buyer in default, seller must have performed his or her obligations under the contract. And then, if either buyer or seller fails to perform their obligations, the non-performing party will be in default. So the critical piece to note if a seller wants to pursue earnest money is that seller has a duty to continue to perform under the contract in order to hold the buyer to his or her obligations. And the seller needs to note whether the buyer has any other outs under the contract, making it worth seller's while to pursue these remedies. If the buyer has other outs under the contract, it may not be worth seller's effort. For example, if buyer has an out under the addendum for property subject to mandatory property owners association, wherein buyer can terminate for any reason after receipt of the subdivision information, or if the subdivision information is not provided, then it may not be worth seller's time and money to pursue default. If you have questions about this issue, please contact me at Allegiance Title. And if you have other topics you would like me to address, send them to tipoftheweek@allegiancetitle.com. Thank you.